Hello again. Over 40 years ago, I married a Swedish woman and went to live in Sweden. It was in those days, the 1970s, that, that Sweden was the dullest and most law abiding country you could possibly imagine. It was far worse than Germany. At that time, Sweden was ethnically homogenous. That is to say, all the people one saw were white and Scandinavian in appearance. It was so peaceful and boring that I couldn't stick it for long, so I returned to the Middle East. Times have changed though, and Sweden is by all accounts a very lively and exciting place to live these days. I think vibrant is perhaps the accepted term to describe society in Sweden today. It is the gun crime centre of Europe. Only Croatia sees more people killed by guns than Sweden. You think things are bad in London, but that's nothing compared to what is happening in Stockholm and Gothenburg. Part of the problem is that the weapons used are not only pistols, which is generally the case in Britain. Machine guns are increasingly being used in attacks together with hand grenades. In other words, military weaponry is being imported into Sweden and used freely. Alongside a ferocious level of violence of this kind has come rioting and an exponential rise in rapes and indecent assaults. In the 1970s, women going topless on beaches, in parks or swimming pools was so common that nobody looked twice. This is the sort of thing that Sweden was famous for. It was a relaxed and easygoing country. Nobody bothered about sex, nudity or anything else. Not anymore. These days, Swedish women are covering up, and the free and easy ways of 40 years ago are a distant memory. Here are a few figures. In 2006, just 8 people were killed by guns in Sweden. 11 years later, in 2017, 43 people were killed in shooting incidents, a 5-fold increase. I might mention that this has not happened in other European countries. In the 7 years between 2011 and 2018, there were 1,500 shootings in Sweden and 100 attacks involving the use of hand grenades. Not only hand grenades, but military explosives. Plastique was used as well, Semtex. In 2018, a total of 162 bombings and grenade attacks took place in the country, compared with none at all 10 years earlier. In 2020, there were 366 shootings in Sweden, 47 people were killed and 117 wounded. Nearly all this violence is a result of fighting between rival groups of immigrants. Sometime after the turn of the millennium in 2000, some Swedish politicians decided that it wasn't right that while the rest of Europe was filling up with newcomers from Africa and Asia, their own country remained 100% white European. It looked a little bit, well, racist perhaps, certainly right-wing and reactionary. So it was that they began admitting immigrants, trying to see how many they could get. These people moved to the poorer areas and soon created their own ghettos. And once they were safely established in the rougher parts of the big cities, they began fighting among themselves, for which purpose they began importing first pistols and then machine guns, grenades and commercial explosives. I give a few links in the description to this video for stuff about this. It's really just Wikipedia and the BBC. But if you try Googling Sweden and hand grenade shootings, rapes and so on, you'll soon see the nature of the problem. Harassment of women, assaults and rapes on them have all soared in the last decade or so. The police figures show that 60% of those convicted of rape were foreigners. In the case of strangers who have attacked women, 80% of the attackers were described by the victims as being foreigners, that is to say black, Asian, Arabs, Kurdish and so on. About 15% of people living in Sweden are now foreigners, roughly 1 in 6, so they're catching up with countries like Britain when it comes to the proportion of foreign-born families. The newspapers and television in Sweden have a convention that they will not mention the downside of immigration, even things like shootings and explosions. They talk about it in a way that avoids explicitly stating that it's foreigners engaging in this sort of thing. They say that much of the country's crime is committed by people living in what are known as vulnerable areas, that is to say the poorer parts of the cities. Although these are now ghettos and practically no-go areas for ordinary Swedish people, nobody wishes to hear this said out loud. And of course, by referring to the vulnerable areas, it ties in with the Marxist idea that things like crime and violence are a product of social deprivation and the class struggle. It's not true, incidentally. It's not true in this country either. There are plenty of poor white people, but in areas where there are a lot of white people that are poor and disadvantaged, you don't get the levels of crime that you do in areas that have a high number of immigrants or foreign-born families. I might mention that during the Depression in the 1930s, conditions for ordinary working families were absolutely hideous. They didn't, in general, resort to crime. Sweden's a fascinating case because it's possible to see the effects of large-scale immigration without any of the confounding factors which we see in countries like Britain, which have had large immigrant populations for generations. In Sweden, we are able to compare the before and after state of the country because all this has happened over the course of just 20 years. In Britain, this collapse of national culture and traditions has happened in slow motion, as one might say. Because it's been spread over 60 or 70 years, it has not been quite so obvious, except to old gimps like me who can remember that far back and compare the past with the present. In Sweden, though, the whole ghastly process has taken place in a few years, and so it's possible to chart the destruction of the Swedish way of life in real time, as you might say, observing it day by day as it happens.